The city shimmered with gold and wrought, its streets filled with the smell of incense and corruption. In the heart of the Vatican, Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, looked over his world with the eyes of a predator. The papal crown pressed heavy on his head, but he carried it with joy. For years he had plotted, bribed, and fought his way to St. Peter's throne. Now, finally, the Holy See belonged to him. The Borgias were not noble by birth, but they were ruthless by nature. Rodrigo's rise came from deals sealed with Spanish gold and whispered promises. Cardinals who stood against him soon lost their power or their lives. The papal court, once a place of prayer, turned into a den of vice. Fortunes were lost and won in gambling, and courtesans moved through the halls like queens. At the center was Lucrezia, Rodrigo's daughter, with golden hair and porcelain skin. She was just 16, already caught in her father's grand plans. Her laughter echoed through the Vatican's golden rooms, but behind her smile was the sharp mind of a girl forced to play a dangerous game. Beside her stood Cesare, her brother, a young cardinal with the cold eyes of a wolf and ambitions greater than even their father's. Whispers began almost at once. Rome thrived on scandal, and the Borgias gave plenty. Rodrigo's mistresses walked openly. His illegitimate children lived inside the Vatican walls. Cesare's bloody reputation grew with every enemy who vanished. And Lucrezia, sweet Lucrezia, was caught in rumors that stained her name. The papal court was a stage, each person playing their part, but the script was written in blood. Outside, the city boiled with anger. People whispered about poisoned wine and daggers in the dark. The Borgias' enemies, the Della Rovers, the Sforzas, circled like vultures, spreading venom through pamphlets and street gossip. Rome had seen corruption before, but never this bold, never this personal. And beneath the painted ceilings of the papal palace, the seeds of a darker legend were sown. The whispers started, small, like smoke. They drifted through taverns, slipped into the Vatican's chambers, and appeared in anonymous pamphlets left in piazzas at dawn. The daughter shares her father's bed. The brother's eyes linger too long. No one knew who said it first, but the rumors spread like plague. The Borgias' enemies didn't need proof, they only needed scandal, and nothing was more shocking than incest. Soon, crude pamphlets appeared with ugly drawings, bodies tangled in embraces, just vague enough to deny, but clear in their meaning. Rodrigo's heavy face, Cesare's sharp features, Lucrezia's flowing hair, all twisted into grotesque cartoons. The words were worse, mock prayers twisted into filth. O Holy Father, who art in bed, unhallowed be thy name. When Lucrezia walked through the Vatican gardens with her ladies, they fell silent as she passed, their eyes sliding away. Even servants whispered behind their hands. She knew what they said, but silence was her only defense. To answer would give the rumors more power. Cesare, the wolf, chose another path. He hunted a printer one night, pressing his dagger to the man's throat until he confessed his patron, Sforza lackey. The next morning, the printer's body floated in the Tiber, his tongue cut out. The warning was clear, but the damage was already done.
Scandal, once set free, could not be caged. Rodrigo brushed it all aside with a wave of his jeweled hand. "Let the dogs bark," he told Lucrezia, his voice thick with wine. "They envy what they cannot have." His calm only made people talk more. Why would a pope not rage against such lies unless the rumors were true? At a banquet hosted by Cardinal Orsini, a poet recited verses with hidden meaning, glancing at Lucrezia as he spoke of flowers plucked too soon. The room shook with muffled laughter. Lucrezia kept her chin high, though her cheeks burned. Later, in her chambers, she smashed a vase in rage. Cesare found her kneeling among the shards. "They will pay," he promised, his voice sharp as a blade. But payment was not enough. The rumors had taken root. In Renaissance Rome, where truth and lies were currency, the most dangerous stories were the ones people wanted to believe. Incest was unforgivable, the corruption of blood, the breaking of nature itself. In a world where the church preached purity, no accusation carried more weight, and for the Borgia's enemies, that made it the perfect weapon. Rome could tolerate bribery, murder, even open mistresses, but incest was different. It was monstrous. The Borgias were already hated for their Spanish blood, their greed, their blatant nepotism, but the whispers of incest turned them into abominations. The irony was cruel. The Borgias were guilty, just not of this. Rodrigo had bought the papacy with chests of gold. Cesare had ordered assassinations without remorse. Lucrezia's marriages were bartered like trade deals, her body used for alliances. These were sins Rome understood, but they weren't enough to destroy the family, not like this rumor could. The pamphlets grew bolder. One slipped under a Venetian ambassador's door showed Lucrezia as a modern-day figure, entwined with both father and brother. Another, read aloud in taverns, told of a papal key that unlocked more than heaven's gates. The Borgia's enemies needed no proof, only doubt. And the people, hungry for scandal, fed it themselves. Even sermons in churches fueled the fire. Priests thundered about morality, about Sodom, about those who defiled sacred bonds. Everyone knew who they meant. A preacher in Florence cried out about a house where serpents nested in the marriage bed. He never named the Borgias. He didn't have to. Lucrezia was trapped. To some, she was a temptress, a seductress who lured her kin. To others, she was a victim, a pawn corrupted by her own family. Truth didn't matter. The story did, and the story was irresistible. Cesare, ever calculating, warned his father, "They paint us as monsters because they cannot beat us as rivals." Rodrigo, lounging with wine in hand, only chuckled. Let them talk. Words are wind. But Cesare knew better. Words could topple empires. The Borgias' true crimes, bribery, murder, ambition, were dull compared to the myth being born. And history remembers not what men did, but what others said they did. Rome was already writing the Borgias' epitaph in poison.
Lucrezia was never just a daughter. She was a key, her father's key to power. From the moment she could walk, she was trained to serve the dynasty. But was she willing? Or was she only a pawn, moved across the board of Renaissance politics? No one could say. Rodrigo never let love get in the way of ambition. He loved Lucrezia, yes, but also used her. She was his jewel, traded for alliances, land, and influence. By 13, she had already been betrothed twice. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza of Pesaro was a cold deal. The Sforzas were powerful in Milan, and the union secured Alexander's northern power. But when politics shifted, so did Lucrezia's fate. The marriage was dissolved under suspicious terms. Giovanni fled Rome in fear, rumors swirling that the annulment was based on his impotence, or worse, that Alexander invented the whole claim to free her for a better match. "You will be a queen," her father whispered, brushing her cheek with false tenderness. "Not a countess, not a lord's wife, a queen." Lucrezia bowed her head. "As you wish, Holy Father," she said, her voice calm. But inside, what did she truly feel? Historians still argue. Some say she was a pawn, her will bent to her father's. Others say she was a hidden player, using her sweetness to hide a sharp, clever mind. Her second marriage to Alfonso of Aragon, a prince of Naples, was another move in Alexander's grand design. Naples was the jewel of the south, and with Lucrezia as queen, the Borgias would rule both Rome and the Mediterranean. But this marriage, too, ended in blood. Alfonso was murdered in Rome, his body broken in an alley.
His killers were never named, but everyone whispered César's name.
It was these marriages, these sudden and brutal changes in her life, that fed the darkest gossip. Why would a father show off his daughter in so many betrothals and annulments unless something strange was going on between them? The pamphlets mocked. What husband could ever satisfy a bride who was already claimed by her own kin? Lucrezia's ladies said they sometimes heard her cry at night, but by morning she was calm again, her face steady like a mask as she went to mass beside her father. Was it resignation? Was it agreement? Or was it the hard strength of a woman who knew that to survive in the Borgia court, you had to play the game better than anyone else? Alexander didn't seem bothered by the rumors. When a cardinal dared to mention the scandal during a meeting, the Pope laughed loudly through the hall. "Do you think I would share such a treasure with any man, even my own son?" The joke was bold, meant to mock the rumors, yet his words carried just enough doubt to make people uneasy. In the end, Lucretia's worth to her father was never questioned. She was the perfect tool, beautiful, clever, soft when she needed to be, and ruthless when she had to. Whether she wanted the role or simply endured it, Alexander didn't care. The Borgias didn't deal in love. They dealt in power, and power, as Rome was learning, was far more dangerous than desire. Cesare Borgia moved through Rome like an unsheathed blade, fast, silent, and deadly. Where his father ruled with gold and cunning, Cesare used steel. His reputation was written in blood. The cardinal who threw away his robes for armor, the Pope's son who led armies as easily as he once quoted scripture. But it was his bond with Lucrezia that really made people whisper. The two siblings were inseparable. Cesare, always the protector, stayed close to her side, warning everyone with just his presence. He walked with her to mass, sat near her at banquets, and scared away her suitors with one hard look. To outsiders, their closeness looked wrong. To the Borgias, it was simply how their world worked. Lucretia seemed to enjoy her brother's shadow. Where others saw menace, she saw loyalty. "No one understands him like I do," she once whispered proudly to her lady-in-waiting. "He is not the monster they say he is." But Rome thought otherwise, or at least believed it did. The rumors had started years earlier, when Lucretia was still a girl. Whispers that Cesare stayed too long in her rooms, that his kisses lingered on her cheek, that his gifts, jewels, silks, even a dagger with a pearl handle, were more fitting for a lover than a brother. The truth was never clear. Cesare was possessive, yes, but was it brotherly love or something darker? No one could say for sure. Even history refuses to draw the line.
What was certain was Cesare's part in Lucrezia's scandals. When her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza collapsed, it was Cesare who handed him the annulment papers, and Cesare who was said to have threatened Giovanni's life if he didn't sign. When her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, was found stabbed in an alley, Cesare's name rose like a corpse floating in the Tiber. "He would kill for her," courtiers whispered, but did he kill because of her? The timing was terrible. Alfonso had been young, handsome, and loved by Lucrezia in a way none of her other husbands had been. Their marriage had been one of rare affection, a glimpse of happiness in the brutal Borgia world, and then it ended in blood. Cesare never confessed, but he never denied it either. When a drunken noble pressed him at a banquet, Cesare only smiled, swirling his wine. A man who cannot keep what is his does not deserve to keep it. The nobleman stayed silent for the rest of the night. Lucrezia's grief was real, her tears seen by all. But within weeks, she was back beside her father, her black mourning clothes replaced with bright silks, her face calm once again. Some said she forgave Cesare. Others whispered she had known everything all along. Their bond grew stronger afterward. Cesare made sure her next husband was chosen by him, Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, a match that secured Borgia power in the north. And Lucrezia, ever the obedient daughter, agreed. But Rome never forgot. The rumors only grew, fed by Cesare's ruthless image and Lucrezia's quiet silence. Were they partners in crime? Did their bond cross from loyalty to something unspeakable? No one knew. The truth was buried under power, lies, and poison. But one thing was clear. In Cesare's shadow, Lucrezia was both guarded and trapped. A queen on a chessboard where every move was decided by blood. And blood, as the Borgias knew best, was the one stain that never washed away. The banquet hall glittered like a golden cage. Candles dripped wax onto silver trays, their flames casting long dancing shadows on the painted walls. Pope Alexander VI sat at the head of the table, laughing loudly as he lifted a jeweled goblet. Around him sat Rome's most powerful men, cardinals in bright red silks, nobles with rings sparkling, all of them unaware they were pieces in a deadly game. This was a Borgia feast, and not everyone would leave alive. Lucrezia, dressed in deep green velvet, played her role with practiced grace. Her fingers brushed her wineglass, her lips curved into a smile that never touched her eyes. Beside him, Cesare lounged like a panther, his gaze sharp as it swept across the hall. The air was heavy with roasted meat, spiced wine, and something else, something bitter under the sweetness. The first to collapse was Cardinal Orsini. His face, flushed with wine, turned pale. He grabbed his stomach, gasping for breath. I feel unwell," he mumbled, but his words were drowned by laughter. By the time his body hit the floor shaking, the servants were already moving, not to help him, but to quietly drag him away. The music never stopped. One by one others fell. A young lord vomited into his plate. A bishop clawed at his throat, his eyes bulging. The poison worked quickly, hidden in the wine, the bread, the sugared fruit. Some said it was Cantarella, the Borgia's secret poison, so perfect it left no trace, only corpses. Lucrezia watched calmly.
When Cesare leaned close, his breath hot against her ear, she didn't move. "They should not have crossed us," he murmured. She sipped her wine. "No, they should not have." By dawn, 6 men were dead. The official story blamed bad shellfish, a tragic accident. But Rome knew better. The whispers spread. The Borgias had murdered their enemies at the table, feasting while their guests choked to death. It wasn't the first poisoned feast, and it wouldn't be the last. These banquets became legend, proof of the family's monstrous ways. Who else would kill guests under the guise of hospitality? Who else would sit calmly, watching, as men died before them? Only the Borgias. As the bodies were carried away, Alexander raised his glass again, smiling as he toasted. "To health," he said, and the survivors, trembling, drank. The wedding had been a dazzling show of silk and gold, a display of Borgia power meant to stun Rome. Lucrezia, only 13, stood at the altar in Venetian lace, her small hands held by Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro. The groom, twice her age, smiled with the pride of a man who thought fortune favored him. He didn't yet know his marriage was just a transaction, one that would end as suddenly as it began, with rumors darker than the Tiber at midnight. The wedding feast was lavish, even by Borgia standards. Wine poured endlessly, and the tables overflowed with food. Roasted peacocks, their feathers stitched back on, looked like grotesque decorations. Lucrezia's face stayed calm, a mask of serenity, as men toasted her and stared at her like a prize. Across the room, her father and brother watched, their faces unreadable. When the time came for the bedding ceremony, the crowd cheered wildly. Tradition demanded the bride be led to the marital bed, where the marriage would be proven before witnesses. But as the crowd surged, Alexander raised his hand. "Enough," he said firmly. "My daughter is still a child. Let them retire in peace." The room fell silent. It was a shocking break of custom, a refusal to let Rome see the marriage sealed. Giovanni's face darkened, but he didn't dare speak against the Pope. Lucrezia was led away by her ladies, her steps careful, her eyes lowered. Behind closed doors, the truth of what happened, or didn't happen, became the subject of endless gossip. Giovanni would later insist the marriage was consummated. Lucrezia, during the annulment, swore it was not. The annulment itself was pure Borgia trickery. Alexander wanted to cut ties with the Sforzas as Milan's politics shifted, so he declared the marriage void for non-consummation.
A deep humiliation for Giovanni, forced to sign papers admitting impotence. No man would admit that willingly. Giovanni spat to his allies after fleeing Rome. They threatened me. The Pope's own son put a knife to my throat. And the rumors took flight. Had Giovanni really been impotent like the Borgias claimed, or was there something darker stopping the marriage from being consummated? Whispers spread through the streets. Did Lucrezia's father or brother interfere? Was she kept untouched for some hidden reason? The Vatican gave its official word. The marriage was invalid, and Lucrezia was free to marry again for the good of the Church. But Rome was not so easily convinced. The annulment smelled of politics, or worse, of secrets too ugly to speak out loud. Lucrezia herself stayed quiet. She pulled back into the convent of San Sisto, her sudden show of piety raising eyebrows. Was it grief? Was it shame? Or just a smart way to let the scandal die down before her father's next plan for her? Giovanni, stripped of his bride and his pride, spent years raging against the Borgias, his fury adding fuel to the gossip. "They are monsters," he wrote to another noble. "What kind of father cancels his daughter's marriage like this unless he wants her for himself?" The question stayed hanging in the air. For Lucrezia, that first wedding night was not a beginning. It was only a warning, a taste of the betrayals and games that would mark her whole life. And for Rome, it was proof that in the Borgia house, even love could be twisted into a weapon. The convent of San Sisto felt like another world compared to the Vatican's golden halls. Its high stone walls blocked out Rome's noise, and the smell of incense and old parchment replaced the rich perfumes of papal luxury. Here, Lucrezia Borgia sought shelter, or at least pretended to. She arrived quickly and quietly, wearing plain wool, her golden hair hidden under a veil. She slipped through the convent gates like a shadow. The abbess, a stern woman with cold eyes, welcomed her with cautious respect. This was the Pope's daughter. Whether sinner or saint, the abbess dared not guess. But whispers followed her inside. In the cloistered halls, the nuns whispered about the scandal that had sent her there. Some pitied her, a young bride abandoned by her husband and family. Others watched with suspicion. Why would a girl of her status choose such a strict life unless she carried a shame too heavy to bear? Soon a rumor grew like a weed. Lucrezia was pregnant. It spread among the nuns as they snuck glances at her waist. Was the child Giovanni's from that short, disputed marriage? Or was it something worse, a child born of sin, its father too shameful to name? Pamphlets in Rome already painted her as a seductress, a daughter who shared her father's bed. Now her retreat into a convent only made the story stronger. Lucrezia said nothing. She went to Mass with her head bowed, fingers clutching her rosary tight. She prayed for hours, lips moving in silence. But the nuns noticed her trembling hands, the way her breath caught when the bells rang. Then Cesare came, unannounced, cloaked, his boots crunching on the courtyard gravel. The abbess nearly fainted seeing him. He and Lucrezia spoke in low, hurried tones near the herb garden, their faces guarded.
The next morning, a physician arrived, a discreet man, not tied to the Vatican. He examined Lucrezia behind locked doors. The nuns pressed their ears to the wood, but heard nothing. When he came out, his face gave no answers. Whatever truth he found stayed hidden. But Rome didn't need proof. The gossips ran wild. Lucrezia, the poisoned flower, had been sent away to hide her shame. Some said she secretly gave birth and the baby was hidden away in the countryside. Others swore she had taken herbs to end the pregnancy, her guilt washed away in blood. When cardinals asked Alexander VI, he laughed off the gossip. "My daughter is pious," he said. "She seeks God's grace. Would you deny her that?" But even his allies looked at each other with doubt. The timing was too neat, the whispers too loud. Lucrezia stayed in San Sisto for months. Her absence fed even more speculation. But when she finally returned, thinner, paler, her eyes were firm. The rumors hadn't broken her. If anything, they had hardened her. Her enemies waited for her to stumble, but she had learned the most important lesson. In the Borgia's world, survival wasn't about innocence or guilt,
It was about control. And so she walked back into the spotlight, her head high, her secrets locked away. Let Rome whisper. She would outlast them all. The streets of Rome were slick with rain the night Alfonso of Aragon died. Lucrezia wept when she heard. Her second husband, kind and handsome Alfonso, the only man she had ever dared to love, was dead. His body lay broken in an alley, stabbed by assassins. The killers disappeared into the dark, leaving behind only blood and the echo of running feet. The city grew silent. Everyone knew who gained from Alfonso's death. The alliance with Aragon had fallen apart. Naples was no longer useful to Alexander VI, and Cesare Borgia, the snake in the garden, had shown nothing but hate for his brother-in-law. Lucrezia, dressed in black, knelt beside her husband's corpse in the dim chapel light. His face was still handsome in death, his violent end clashing with the peace that seemed to rest on his features. She kissed his cold forehead, her tears wetting his chest. "Who did this?" she whispered. The guard shifted, but no one spoke. Rome already had its answer. Cesare arrived at dawn, his boots leaving mud on the chapel floor. He stood over Alfonso's body, his face unreadable. Lucrezia didn't look up. "You mourn too loudly," he finally said. "The Aragons will use your grief against us." Her hands shook. "Did you do it?" The silence was her answer. Cesare exhaled through his nose, almost like regret. "He was a threat. You know this." Lucrezia's breath caught. Alfonso had been many things, a prince, a pawn in her father's games, but he had never been a threat to her. He had brought her poems, music, soft moments in a life built on cruelty. And now he was gone. Cesare reached for her, but she pulled away. His jaw tightened. "The world is cruel to women who love too freely," he said coldly. "I spared you from learning it too late." His words cut her deeper than any knife.
Outside, the rumors spread like fire. The Borgia had killed again, but this time it was different. This wasn't an enemy or a rival. This was Lucrezia's husband, her heart. And if Cesare could do this, what else could he do? Pamphlets exploded across the city, showing Cesare as Cain and Lucrezia as a weeping Abel. Their enemies mocked them with fake pity. What kind of brother kills his sister's love? Unless the love was his to begin with. Lucrezia's grief was public, but her rage was private. She locked herself in her rooms, refusing gifts even from her father. Perfumes and jewels sat untouched. For the first time, the beautiful daughter had been betrayed, and Rome would never forget it. Alfonso's murder became central to the Borgia legend, proof that no one, not even family, was safe. The old whispers of incest, once dismissed as slander, now carried new weight. Why else, people asked, would Cesare destroy the one man Lucrezia truly loved? Cesare himself seemed untouched by the storm. When a Spanish envoy asked him about it, he only smiled and offered a glass of wine. "Accidents happen," he said. The envoy refused the drink. Lucrezia turned into a ghost in her palace. Her ladies heard her weep at night, but by day she was silent and beautiful, her feelings locked away. Only once did she speak out. At a private mass for Alfonso's soul, she turned to her brother, her voice quiet. "You took him from me." Cesare's eyes stayed steady. "I protected you." She laughed then, sharp and bitter. "No, you only proved what they all say about us." And she walked away.
Alfonso's blood sealed the Borgia family's fate. From that night on, the world saw them not just as corrupt, not just as ruthless, but as something worse. A family that destroyed its own. And Lucrezia, the eternal pawn, had learned the hardest truth. In the Borgia house, even love could be a death sentence. The Vatican's corridors still whispered with silk and smelled of perfume long after prayers ended. Pope Alexander VI, God's chosen man on earth, wore holy robes by day, but by night he showed his real desires. His mistresses walked through the palace like shadows, their laughter echoing where hymns should have been.
Giulia Farnese, called La Bella for her golden hair, was the most famous. She was barely 16 when she caught the Pope's eye. She became his public mistress, even painted as the Virgin Mary in Vatican frescoes, a blasphemy that shocked even cardinals who were used to sin. Then there was Venosa de Catania, the mother of his 4 oldest children. Her influence lingered long after their love ended. Others came and went, their names barely remembered, just passing figures in the papal bed. Rome had tolerated popes with mistresses before, but Alexander flaunted his sins. He threw banquets where his lovers sat with bishops, their jewels sparkling in candlelight. He gave his bastards titles and lands, placing them above church princes. His daughter Lucrezia, born of Venosa, was prepared for powerful marriages. His son Cesare, once a cardinal, cast aside his robes to become a soldier and warlord. The hypocrisy was shocking. He preached chastity in sermons, but lived in constant debauchery. A Venetian envoy wrote home in secret, sealing his letter before Borgia's spies could catch it. The Pope's enemies now had plenty of proof. If Alexander could so openly break his vow of celibacy, what other holy lines would he cross?
The whispers spread everywhere, from taverns to church councils. A man who kept mistresses might even keep his daughter as one. The old incest rumor, once seen as too wild, now found believers. Even his own men grew uneasy. Cardinal Sforza, no stranger to vice himself, crossed himself when he saw Giulia Farnese sitting on the Pope's throne arm. "God sees," he muttered. "God forgives," another replied, "but the people do not." Alexander didn't care. He adored his children, legitimate or not, almost to the point of worship. When Lucretia turned 16, he gave her a palace filled with tapestries of nymphs and satyrs. When Cesare demanded control of the papal armies, Alexander simply ended his role as a cardinal with a wave of his hand. The message was clear: blood came before God. The mistresses played their parts cleverly. Giulia, always a survivor, won Lucretia's trust with gifts and secrets. Venosa, though set aside, remained powerful in Rome's underworld, her inns and brothels buzzing with gossip. They knew their worth to Alexander, and they knew the cost of falling from grace. But it was Lucretia who paid most. Every time her father paraded a new lover, every time he kissed Giulia's hand in public, the rumors about her grew louder. If the Pope had no shame, what lines were left? The final outrage came when Alexander hosted a ball to celebrate the birth of another bastard, this time with a woman so young that even the guests turned away in discomfort. That night, as wine flowed and dancers spun, a Spanish bishop dared to speak. "Holiness," he said, "is this seemly?" Alexander, with Giulia at his side, laughed until his jowls shook. Raising his cup, he mocked, "We are all God's children, are we not?" The bishop left pale and silent. Within weeks, the story spread across Europe, each retelling worse than the last. By the time it reached Paris, the ball was described as an orgy, the baby a demon, and Lucrezia painted as the willing partner in her father's sins. Alexander's real crime was not the mistresses, it was his arrogance, his refusal to even pretend to be holy. In a world where power depended on image, he had ripped away the mask. And that made every ugly rumor about his family seem believable. As Giulia Farnese said to a lover, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "When the Pope plays the devil, who can say where the act ends?" That question haunted Lucrezia everywhere she went, and Rome, always hungry for scandal, already believed it had the answer. The summer of 1503 was suffocating. The air stank of the Tiber's sluggish waters and the sweat of a city drowning in its own corruption. Rome boiled, and at its center was Pope Alexander VI, once untouchable, now a haunted man. His jowls sagged, his hands shook, and his booming laugh had become a thin rasp. On the night of August 18th, Alexander dined with Cardinal Adriano da Corneto at a villa outside Rome.
The feast was as grand as always: roast pheasant, figs dripping with honey, wine from the Pope's private cellars. But as the night went on, people noticed something wrong. The Pope, normally a glutton for food and talk, barely touched his plate. His face turned pale. "Holiness," Cornetto asked, "are you ill?" Alexander waved it off. "Just the heat." But by midnight, he was in agony. Servants rushed him back to the Vatican, his robes soaked with sweat, his breathing ragged. Doctors were called, their whispers carried in corners. Some said fever, others blamed too much rich food, but Rome was convinced it was poison. The rumor spread like fire. Had the Della Riveras finally succeeded where their armies failed? Had the Sforzas, still angry over Lucrezia's annulled marriage, poisoned his wine? Or had God himself punished him at last?
Cesare, returning from war, found chaos in his father's chambers. The mighty Pope lay shrunken in silk sheets, his skin blotched, his eyes wild. At his side, Lucrezia clutched holy water, praying. "Who did this?" Cesare demanded, his voice sharp as steel. The doctors hesitated. Perhaps nature, or maybe... The signs looked like Cantarella. The word hung heavy. Cantarella, the Borgia's own poison, said to leave no trace. Had Alexander fallen to his own weapon? Cesare's face darkened. He turned to his sister. Who was with him last? Lucrezia's hands shook. Cornetto, but surely not. Cesare spat the name. A Della Rover pawn. Yet doubt flickered in his eyes. Some whispered poison was a woman's weapon. Could it have been a mistress, or someone even closer? Alexander's last hours were a nightmare. He raved about demons, about flames at his feet. Sometimes he called for Lucrezia, begging her forgiveness. Other times he cursed shadows no one else could see. On the third day, as the sun set red, his breath stopped. Silence filled the Vatican. Then from the streets came a murmur, then a roar. The people of Rome, long crushed under Borgia rule, shouted in grief, relief, and disbelief. The Pope was dead. But in the Vatican, Cesare stood over his father's body, unreadable. Lucrezia, her cheeks wet with tears, reached for his hand. He didn't take it. This changes nothing. We are still Borgias. But outside, enemies circled. The Della Rovers, the Sforzas, the Orsinis, all saw their chance. The papal throne was empty, and the Borgia's grip on power was slipping. Stones hit the Vatican gates. One question burned hotter than the sun. Was Alexander killed by poison or by God's hand? Rome would never agree, but one thing was clear. The Borgia era was ending, and it would end in blood. Without Alexander's iron grip, Rome turned on them like starving wolves. Cesare, who once was the proud commander of papal armies, was suddenly powerless. His father's death cut his strings. The new pope, Pius III, lasted only weeks before the Della Rover family secured the throne for Julius II, their old enemy. The Borgia Golden Age was gone. Cesare fled Rome under cover of night, his armor traded for a merchant's cloak, his famous swagger replaced with hurried, desperate steps of a man on the run.
But even in exile, his name carried too much weight. Captured in Naples by Gonzalo de Córdoba, the Spanish general who had once been his ally, Cesare was thrown into a dungeon, his fate no longer his own. The news reached Lucrezia in Ferrara, where she had rebuilt her life as the Duchess of Este. The letter shook in her hands as she read of her brother's imprisonment, first in Spain, then in the dark fortress of La Mota. The man who had once commanded armies now rotted in a cell, his enemies enjoying his downfall. "He will not last the winter," her informant wrote. "The Spanish king has no love for traitors." Lucrezia did not cry. She had shed too many tears for the Borgias already. Instead, she folded the letter and tucked it into her gown, her face calm and composed.
But in the privacy of her chambers, she pressed her forehead to the cold stone window and whispered a name she had not spoken in years, Cesare. His end came quickly. In 1507, only 4 years after their father's death, Cesare Borgia died in a small battle in Navarre, not killed by a famous rival, but by a nameless soldier's spear. The man who had once terrified Italy fell without honor, his body left for the crows. When word reached Ferrara, Lucrezia ordered a mass for his soul. She knelt in the cathedral, her black veil covering her face, her lips moving in silent prayer. The courtiers whispered. Was she mourning the brother who had loved her too much, or the monster who had ruined so much? Maybe both. For Lucrezia, Cesare's death was the final cut from her past. With him gone, the last tie to the Borgia name was broken. No longer the Pope's daughter, no longer the warlord's sister, she was free, if freedom was even possible, to be just herself. Lucrezia, Duchess of Este, a woman who had outlived the legends. But the scars remained. In the quiet of night, she sometimes dreamed of Rome, of golden halls and poisoned feasts, of a brother's possessive grip and a father's cold smile. She would wake gasping, clutching her sheets, their voices still echoing in her ears. Yet by morning, she was always steady again. She had learned the hardest lesson of all. Survival was not about escaping the past. It was about burying it so deep that no one, not even she, could hear its whispers. And so she lived, not as a Borgia, but as something else, a woman who had survived them. Ferrara, 1500s. The ducal palace rose like a fortress of marble and light, its gardens filled with the scent of orange blossoms and the sound of fountains. Here, far from Rome's poison, Lucrezia Borgia, now Lucrezia d'Este, walked the sunny halls as a woman reborn. Her third marriage had saved her. Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, was no romantic poet like her doomed Alfonso of Aragon, nor a pawn like Giovanni Sforza. He was a ruler, practical and steady, not shaken by the rumors that followed his bride. When he first met Lucrezia, his gaze was cool, not lustful. "I care little for gossip," he told her plainly, "only for loyalty." And so Lucrezia vowed to be loyal.
She threw herself into her new role with surprising energy. No longer the decoration of the Vatican, she became the heart of Ferrara, patron of poets, protector of artists, mother to her growing Este children. At first, the people distrusted the infamous Borgia daughter, but soon they whispered of her kindness, how she fed the poor during famine, how she knelt in church for hours in real prayer. Yet redemption was never easy. The past clung to her like a shadow. At masquerades, guests still murmured behind their masks. Did she poison rivals? Did she sleep with her brother? Pamphlets reached Ferrara, smuggled in by merchants, staining her new life with old sins. Even her ladies, though loyal in public, sometimes flinched when she touched their hands. One evening, as she walked in the gardens holding her youngest son, her husband joined her, his boots crunching the gravel. "They still talk," Alfonso said softly. Lucrezia did not pretend to misunderstand. "They always will. Does it trouble you?" She looked down at her child, innocent of the world's cruelty. Once it would have. Now, let them whisper. I know who I am. Alfonso studied her. "You are my wife, the mother of my heirs. That is all that matters." But Lucrezia knew better. The Borgia name could not be erased so easily. Caesar's ghost still haunted her. His death had come like thunder, a brutal end for a brutal man. She mourned him in secret, lighting candles where no one could see her tears. The brother who had loved her and betrayed her, who shaped her fate as much as her father, was gone. With him, the last witness to the girl she once was. Yet even in Ferrara, the rumors followed. A friar preached in the square about a scarlet woman whose sins could never be forgiven. The crowd looked toward the palace. Alfonso expelled the preacher, but the damage was done. Lucrezia's greatest struggle was not for power, but for memory. She could not change the past, but she could shape the future. She commissioned portraits showing her as a pious duchess, a devoted mother. She gave money to convents, her name carved into stone as a patron of charity. She worked to make sure history would remember her as more than a Borgia. And yet, on the anniversary of her father's death, she stood alone in her chamber with a cup of wine. The years had softened her face, but not her heavy eyes. She raised the cup in a whisper. To the house of Borgia, may its curses die with me. Outside, the bells of Ferrara rang, pure and bright. The world moved on. But Lucrezia always wondered, had she escaped the curse, or was its last keeper? The answer, like her legacy, was not hers to choose. The Borgia myth endures, not because it is true, but because it is irresistible. Centuries have passed since Lucrezia's last breath in Ferrara, since Caesar's blood soaked into Navarra's soil, since Alexander VI's body was laid in a tomb his enemies later desecrated. Yet the whispers remain. The incest, the poison, the unspeakable sins cling to their name like a shadow that history cannot erase. Why? The answer lies in power and the stories we tell about it. The Borgias were guilty of much: bribery, murder, nepotism, betrayal. But these were the normal crimes of Renaissance politics, shared by every ruling family, from Florence to Venice. What made the Borgias different was their boldness. They showed their sins openly in a time that demanded hypocrisy. Alexander VI kept mistresses in public, gave his children noble seats, and turned the Vatican into a stage of excess. Cesare threw off his cardinal's robes for a soldier's armor, his ambition as clear as his sword. And Lucrezia, beautiful and mysterious, played the game with such grace that her silence made her guilt seem worse. Their real crimes were shocking enough, but myths are stronger than truth. The incest rumor lasted because it was the perfect slander. Impossible to prove, impossible to forget, and utterly poisonous. In a world where the church preached purity while living in corruption, the idea of a pope sleeping with his daughter was the ultimate accusation. It was easy to believe. It reduced the Borgias' complicated schemes to something primal, something that stuck in the imagination like a hook. And perhaps people wanted to believe it. The Borgias embodied the darkest fears of power with no limits. They were the monsters behind the Renaissance's golden mask, proof that even God's chosen could be devils in disguise. Their legend was both a warning and a guilty thrill. To call them sinners was boring. To call them monsters was unforgettable. Lucrezia especially became the canvas for every fear and fantasy. Was she a victim or a villain? A pawn or a player? The truth, as always, was blurred. She was a woman trapped in a world that gave her no real choices. But history prefers women to be either saints or whores, and Lucrezia was too complex for either. The Borgia myth tells us less about them and more about us. It shows our hunger for stories that prove power always corrupts, beauty hides evil, and our leaders are as rotten as we fear. The Borgias didn't invent these truths. They just lived them so openly that their legend could never die. And so, the lies outlived the truth. The pamphlets of Renaissance Rome have turned into the history books of today. The ink has faded, but the poison remains. We still whisper of Lucrezia's crimes, Cesada's desires, Alexander's lusts. We do it because the alternative, that they were only human, ruthless in ordinary ways, is less exciting. In the end, the Borgias' true legacy is not the sins they committed, but the stories we keep alive. And maybe that was their greatest sin of all.